My name is Claire Matsuda. I am 36 years old, and I want to tell you, Mom, about the afternoon of March 9th when you sat at my kitchen table, set your reading glasses on top of the folder you'd brought, and said, "We need to move in by April." Your father and I discussed it, and this is what makes sense for everyone. You said it the way someone orders lunch, no question mark, no breath of hesitation. You had already decided what my house was for. You assumed I would do what I always did, absorb it, rearrange my life around your latest emergency, and thank you for letting me help. I want you to know what I was thinking at the exact moment you said it. I was looking at the folder under your glasses. It was a manila folder, but the tab was printed, not handwritten, and the font was Calibri, 11 point, which meant it came off a home printer, not from a professional office. And something in my chest went very, very still. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence fill the kitchen like cold water rising around our ankles. You mistook that silence for agreement. What you couldn't hear was the decision I had already made. But I'm not here to talk to you. Not really. You'll hear this eventually, or you won't. What I'm here to do is talk to you, the person listening right now. Before I tell you what I found when I started looking, what time is it where you are? I want to know how many people heard something they recognized in that opening, because what I'm about to describe is not unusual. It's just usually invisible. The first time I smelled acetone in a place it didn't belong, I was 23, standing in a basement archive in Salem, Oregon, running my gloved finger along the margin of an 1891 property deed. I was a document preservation specialist, trained in archival conservation, paper forensics, and authentication protocols for municipal records. My hands could feel the difference between foxing caused by age and foxing caused by chemical acceleration. My eyes could detect erasure ghosting, toner inconsistencies, fiber disruption from mechanical alteration. I spent 11 years in county records departments and private collections, verifying that the documents people trusted were what they claimed to be. That skill had authenticated over 14,000 documents for courts, estates, and historical societies. It was about to authenticate the lies inside my own family. Let me go back. I grew up in a two-story colonial in Tigard, outside Portland. My father, Richard, was a retired postal supervisor. My mother, June, managed the household with the administrative precision of someone who had once worked as a legal secretary and never stopped organizing the world into folders. My brother Nolan was 4 years older and had been, since approximately the age of 15, the center of every financial decision my parents made. Not because he was talented, though they believed he was, but because he was expensive. Everything about Nolan required investment. His first year at the University of Oregon lasted one semester. My parents paid for the full year anyway, plus the apartment lease he refused to break. His second attempt at college, a private business school in Scottsdale, lasted 7 months and cost $41,000 in tuition alone. When that ended, there was a restaurant concept, then a tech startup that was actually a website, then a real estate licensing course he completed but never used, then a second restaurant, then a franchise opportunity in Las Vegas that required a $70,000 buy-in. I could recite these from memory. I could recite the amounts, too, because for a period of about 6 years, my mother would call me after each one to explain why this time was different, why this investment was the one that would turn Nolan's potential into something tangible. Why my parents had no choice, because you don't give up on your own child. I never received a phone call like that about myself. I received different calls. Could I cover the insurance gap while Dad switched plans? Could I co-sign the refinance so the rate would drop? Could I put the deposit on the Scottsdale apartment because Nolan's credit wasn't ready yet? I said yes to all of it, every single time. At 29, I bought a house, a 1,200 square foot bungalow in Milwaukie, Oregon. I paid for it with money I had saved over 6 years of salaried work and freelance authentication contracts. The down payment was $67,400. I remember the exact number because I had watched it grow in a savings account I never told my parents about. Not because I was hiding it, because if they had known it existed, it would have been redirected before it ever reached the title company. I fixed that house with my own hands, refinished the original fur floors, replaced the porch railing, Built shelving in the garage for my reference library, my Hertzberg volumes, my Macrory fiber atlases, my UV light kits. That house was the first space in my adult life that belonged to me without a footnote, without a lien of obligation attached. And then Nolan's Las Vegas franchise collapsed. And then a second venture, some kind of logistics consulting firm that, as far as I could tell, had no clients, collapsed. And then, over 18 months, my parents liquidated what remained of their retirement. The total, when I later reconstructed it from bank records and account statements, was $583,000. $583,000, gone into Nolan's serial failures over roughly 22 years. The irony was that I spent my professional life determining whether documents were genuine, whether the thing people trusted was actually what it claimed to be. I could identify a forged county seal at arm's length, but I lived inside a family whose entire operating logic was a forgery, a story about equal love applied unequally for 3 decades, and I authenticated it every time I picked up the phone and said yes. After the money was gone, my parents sold their house. They moved into a rental apartment. And then, on March 9th, my mother appeared at my kitchen table with that manila folder and those reading glasses and that sentence, "We need to move in by April," as though my house were a room in their house that happened to have a different address. My father stood behind her in the hallway. He didn't sit down. He was holding his coat. He looked at the wall above my head. He said nothing. "You said, 'This is what makes sense for everyone.' And I said, 'Let me look at what you've brought.' You heard surrender. What you couldn't hear was the decision I had already made." I opened the folder. Inside were 4 documents. The first was a printout of my mortgage statement. My mortgage statement, with my loan number, my balance, my payment schedule. They had it. I had never given it to them. The second was a typed letter, unsigned, proposing that my parents would move into my house, contribute $300 a month toward household expenses, and that I would continue making mortgage payments while they recovered. The third was a 1-page summary of what they described as Nolan's current debt obligations, totaling $112,000, with a handwritten note at the bottom that said, "Claire to assist per family agreement." There was no family agreement. There had never been a family agreement. The fourth document was a printed estimate for converting my garage into a bedroom. I turned that 4th page over. I looked at the estimate header. It listed a contractor name and a license number. The license number was formatted with a dash in the wrong position. Oregon CCB numbers follow a specific pattern, and this one didn't match. The estimate was dated February 21st. The font was Calibri, 11 point. Same as the folder tab, same as the letter. Every document in that folder had been created on the same computer, in the same sitting, probably on the same afternoon. I set the folder down. I didn't look up. I pressed my fingertips flat on the table and held them there until I could feel the grain of the wood beneath my skin. Something in me was running calculations I hadn't consciously started. The mortgage statement meant they had accessed my mail or my account. The garage estimate meant they had already planned the renovation before asking me. The debt summary meant Nolan was part of this, or at least his debt was being used as the lever. I closed the folder. I said, "I need a few days." My mother said, "We don't have a few days, Claire. The lease ends on the 30th. I said, "You'll have an answer by Friday." Then I spent 3 weeks doing what I do. I verified. I started with the mortgage statement. I called my lender. No one had been added to my account. No one had requested statements. But my parents had been listed as my emergency contact since I'd bought the house. And when I checked my online portal, I found that the mailing address for paper statements had been changed 5 months earlier to my parents' rental apartment. My mother had redirected my mail. I restored the address and put a verbal password on the account. Next, the contractor estimate. I looked up the name. No Oregon CCB license existed for that contractor. I searched the license number on the state database. It belonged to a landscaping company in Bend that had been inactive since 2019. The estimate was fabricated. Someone had found an expired license number and attached it to a made-up contractor to make the document look legitimate. The file properties, because the estimate had been emailed to my father's account, which I accessed after he gave me his login to help with something else, showed the author field as NRM, Nolan Richard Matsuda. My brother had created the estimate. My brother had formatted the folder. My brother, who supposedly owed $112,000 and was drowning, had sat down at a computer and manufactured a paper trail designed to move our parents into my house and obligate me to fund both their living expenses and his debts. Then I found the older pattern. I called my aunt, my father's sister Diane, who had been largely cut off from the family after a dispute 6 years earlier. Diane told me something I had never known. In 2017, Nolan had approached her with a nearly identical proposal. He'd presented a folder of documents, a summary of my parents' financial needs, an estimate for home modifications, and a request that Diane allow my parents to move into her spare property in Astoria. Diane had refused. Within 2 weeks, my mother had called Diane's adult children and told them Diane had turned her back on the family. Diane had been cut off since. Mom, I want to make sure you understand what I found, because the next part is the part you thought no one would find. I pulled Nolan's public records. In October of the previous year, Nolan had registered a single-member LLC in Nevada called Grayline Properties. Grayline Properties had one asset, a lease option contract on a 2-bedroom condominium in Henderson outside Las Vegas. The option price was $94,000. The funding source listed on the filing was a personal loan from Richard and June Matsuda in the amount of, and I held this document for a very long time when I read it, $94,000, disbursed 9 months before my mother sat at my kitchen table. While they were supposedly broke. While they were supposedly losing their apartment. My parents had given Nolan $94,000 for a condo purchase, depleting what I now realized was the last of their accessible funds. And then, when the money was gone and the condo deal stalled, they had come to me. They were not moving into my house because they had nowhere to go. They were moving into my house because Nolan still needed funding, and the only remaining asset in the family was my property. I gathered the documents. I organized them the way I organize authentication files, chronologically, with source verification notes clipped to each page. I put them in a blue archival folder, because that is what I use for verified originals. And then I called a family meeting. My mother chose the location. Of course she did. Nolan's rental, a townhouse in Lake Oswego that was nicer than anything I had ever lived in, paid for with money my parents had provided as temporary support 3 years earlier. Glass dining table, leather chairs, a framed photograph of Nolan shaking hands with someone at a business conference nobody could name. My mother had set out coffee in a ceramic carafe. She had brought pastries from a bakery. The table was set for reconciliation, on her terms, in her son's monument to her investment. I brought the blue folder. My father was there. Nolan was there. My mother sat at the head of the table. Nolan's girlfriend, Megan, was in the kitchen, half listening, and my Aunt Diane, whom I had asked to come, and who had driven 2 hours from Astoria, sat in a chair near the door. My mother's face changed when Diane walked in, not dramatically. Her lips pressed together exactly 1 millimeter tighter. She did not say hello. I opened the folder. I placed the redirected mortgage statement on the table and said, "You changed my mailing address to receive my bank statements without my knowledge." My mother said, "I was helping you stay organized. You're always so busy." I placed the fabricated contractor estimate on the table. This contractor doesn't exist. The license number belongs to an inactive landscaping company. The document was created by Nolan. Nolan leaned forward. "That's not true. I got that from a guy at a networking event." I placed the file properties printout next to the estimate. The author field says NRM. Your initials, created February 19th, 2 days before the estimate date. My mother said, "Claire, this isn't a courtroom. We are your family. We came to you because we had no other option. After everything we've done for you, the years of support, the sacrifices." What sacrifices? That was Diane. From the chair by the door. Her voice was not loud. She said it the way you read a line item on a receipt. "June, what sacrifices did you make for Claire? Because I can tell you the ones you made for Nolan. I have the folder he brought to my house in 2017. Same format, same font, Same request. My mother turned to look at Diane as though she had materialized from a wall. Nolan shifted in his chair. His jaw tightened. This is a family matter, my mother said. Diane, you removed yourself from this family years ago. Diane said, you removed me because I said no. Nolan stood up. This is ridiculous. Claire, you're doing this because you've always been jealous. You've always resented that Mom and Dad believed in me. Sit down, my father said. It was the first thing he'd said. Nolan sat. I placed the Grayline Properties LLC filing on the table. I placed the personal loan document beside it. $94,000. Disbursed 9 months before the kitchen table meeting. My mother looked at the document. Her hand moved toward it and stopped. I said one sentence. I said it to her, but I said it for the room. You did not come to me because you were out of options. You came to me because Nolan ran out of my money to spend, and you needed a new source. Nobody spoke for what felt like 12 seconds. Megan, Nolan's girlfriend, set down the dish towel she'd been holding. She walked to the edge of the dining room and looked at the LLC filing. She read it. She looked at Nolan, she said. You told me the condo fell through because of the market. Nolan said nothing. Megan picked up her bag from the counter and walked out the front door. I heard her car start. In the weeks that followed, things moved with the slow, heavy inevitability of something that had been overdue for decades. I changed my locks. I placed a fraud alert on my credit. I sent a certified letter to both parents stating that no financial assistance of any kind would be forthcoming, and that any further attempt to access my accounts or redirect my mail would result in a police report. My father called once, 3 days after the meeting. He said, "Your mother is very upset." I said, "I understand." He waited for more. There was no more. Nolan's LLC was dissolved by the state of Nevada 60 days later for failure to file an annual report. The condo option lapsed. Grayline Properties existed for 11 months and produced nothing except a $94,000 hole in my parents' finances. My parents moved in with Nolan, into the Lake Oswego townhouse. My mother, who had intended to live in my house rent-free while I funded her son's real estate ambitions, was now sleeping in her son's guest room, the son she had spent $583,000 building into something that never materialized. Megan left Nolan within the month. She sent me a message, brief, no drama. She said she'd found other discrepancies in Nolan's financial claims and was consulting an attorney. I did not respond, but I saved the message. My father, Richard, came to my house once more, in June. He stood on the porch. He didn't come inside. He said, "I should have said something a long time ago. I don't know when I stopped being able to." I looked at him for a while. I said, "I know, Dad." I didn't invite him in. Not because I was punishing him, but because the threshold of my house had become the one boundary I was not willing to blur. Not yet, maybe later, but not that day. Diane and I began talking regularly, not about my parents, about other things, about her work, about preservation techniques she'd read about the coast. She told me once, on the phone, that she had spent 6 years wondering if she'd been wrong to refuse Nolan's request. I thought maybe I was being selfish, she said. "Thank you for showing me the folder," I said. "Thank you for driving 2 hours." She paused. She said I should have driven sooner. That apology was real, and it was not enough to undo 6 years of silence. We both knew that. We kept talking anyway. In August, I converted my garage back into what it was meant to be, my workspace. I reinstalled my archival shelving. I set up my light table. I unpacked the UV kits that had been boxed since March, when the garage had briefly existed in my mother's imagination as a bedroom. I sat on the stool at my workstation and opened a file I'd been hired to authenticate, a set of 19th century water rights documents for a county historical society in southern Oregon. The paper was foxed and beautiful. The ink had oxidized to the exact shade of brown that tells you a document has been untouched for over a century. I held it under the lamp, and I felt, for the first time in months, the specific pleasure of examining something genuine. What I learned, finally, is that naming something precisely is not an act of cruelty. It is the opposite. It is the refusal to let a distortion stand as though it were the record. My family operated on a version of events that had never been authenticated, a story in which love meant unlimited subsidy, loyalty meant silence, and the person who asked questions was the one who had broken faith. I did not break that story. I examined it. I held it up to the light. And when the fibers didn't match, I said so. That is not betrayal, that is correction. The people who loved me inside that system loved me conditionally, on the condition that I never verified the terms. The moment I applied the same scrutiny to my family's claims that I applied to a stranger's property deed, the entire structure failed. That failure was not something I caused, it was something I revealed. And revelation is not the same as destruction, even when it feels that way to the people who built on the fault line. Mom, there is one thing I never said to you directly. I am saying it now. You had two children, you chose one, and you used the other to fund the choice. That is not a family. That is an invoice with a silence clause. It is September now. The air is cooler. I sit at my workstation in the garage with the door open, and I can smell Douglas fir and wet pavement, and the light comes in at the angle that makes old paper glow. I'm holding a document, not a manila folder, not a fabricated estimate, not a debt summary assembled to leverage my guilt. I'm holding a water rights deed from 1887, and it is exactly what it claims to be. The ink is genuine, the seal is authentic, and I verified it myself. If there is someone in your life you've been describing in third person, to friends, to yourself, in the quiet edits you make before you say their name out loud, because saying it to them directly would require you to believe what you already know, what would you say if you finally believed it? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection. We hope it reminded you that your dignity is not negotiable, and that setting a boundary, even a painful one, can be an act of love for yourself and everyone the pattern would have reached next.